In our first episode, we traced the uneasy history of Russia and China, two great powers bound together yet divided by mistrust and ambition. Today, we turn our focus back to Europe, to the moment when the continent's illusions shattered. An invasion that ruptured the post-Cold War order, the beginning of something darker, more uncertain. In this episode, we explore how the events of that day reshaped global politics, how the European Union suddenly found itself exposed with an increasingly isolationist United States no longer the predictable anchor it once was, how the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, led by Russia and China, aligned itself not through declarations of support, but through silence, abstention, and strategic ambiguity, and how the war in Ukraine accelerated a deeper pattern, the rise of regional blocs, defined not by cooperation, but by rivalry. This is the story of a world drifting toward fragmentation, a world where alliances are tightening, trust is eroding, and the very rules that held the peace for decades are beginning to crack. Welcome to Episode 2 of A Dark Dawn. A war triggering a new era? The moment when Europe's security order was rewritten and the fault lines of a new geopolitical age came into sharp focus. On the morning of the 24th of February, 2022, Vladimir Putin stepped in front of the cameras and delivered a message that would reverberate across the planet. His tone was solemn, almost ritualistic, as he announced what he called a special military operation. But the world knew immediately what it truly was: the beginning of a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the largest act of state-on-state aggression Europe had witnessed in generations. Within minutes, it felt as though the decades of fragile peace that had defined the post-Cold War world were collapsing in real time. The global system, the European neighborhood, even the often overlooked Baltic region, all seemed to complete a grim circle. Old tensions thought to be buried under 30 years of diplomacy and economic interdependence resurfaced with startling clarity. The Kremlin, which once cautiously cooperated with the West, now stood not merely as a skeptical partner or strategic rival, but as an openly hostile adversary. And perhaps what made that moment so jarring was the sheer contrast to the optimism that had followed the fall of the Soviet Union. There was a time, and not long ago, when the phrase, "the end of history," captured the imagination of policymakers and scholars alike. When crowds filled Russian streets with hope, when Western presidents and Russian leaders laughed together on brightly lit stages, when American pop stars performed for millions of newly hopeful citizens, it was an era that many believed signaled a new global chapter, one in which democracy and integration would steadily expand. But as Putin spoke that morning, all of that felt like an illusion, a distant mirage shimmering on the horizon of a world that never quite materialized. The optimism of the 1990s had evaporated, replaced by a harsher truth. Russia's invasion marked not just another conflict, but a true historic rupture. In a single morning, Europe's largest country hurled its full military weight against Europe's second largest, striking from the north, the east, and the south, a three-front assault that echoed the darkest chapters of the 20th century. Columns of armor pushed toward Kyiv, missiles streaked across the sky, and cities that had been peaceful just hours before suddenly found themselves at the center of the largest interstate war on European soil since the Second World War. What made this moment so seismic was not only the scale of the attack, but the principle it destroyed. For decades, European security had rested on one foundational rule: borders must never be altered by brute force. It was the lesson learned from two world wars, the anchor that allowed former enemies to build trust, cooperate, and integrate. And yet, in a matter of hours, that rule was shattered. With its invasion, Russia challenged the entire architecture of post-war Europe, the treaties, the norms, the assumptions that had allowed the continent to believe that full-scale war was a thing of the past. This was not simply a regional dispute. It was a deliberate strike at the very idea of a stable, rule-based Europe, and a warning shot to the global order built in the aftermath of 1945. From the perspective of historical institutionalism, events like these are more than dramatic headlines. They are what scholars call critical junctures. These are rare moments when the usual inertia of the world breaks open, when choices made under pressure set in motion long-term paths that can shape decades, sometimes even centuries, of future outcomes. After such moments, the world doesn't simply continue as it was. It shifts, recalibrates, and often becomes something fundamentally different. The end of the Cold War was one of those transformative junctures. It was a moment drenched in optimism when the seemingly impossible had happened. The Soviet Union dissolved without plunging the world into chaos, Berlin's concrete barrier fell, and Eastern Europe opened itself to democratic reform. For many, it felt as though humanity had finally stepped out of the long shadow of ideological confrontation. It was during this hopeful era that Francis Fukuyama famously proclaimed the end of history. Not the end of events, of course, but the end of humanity's ideological evolution. Liberal democracy, he argued, had triumphed, and the great struggles between competing visions of how societies should be organized were now behind us. Globalization, interdependence, and shared institutions were expected to usher in a stable, rules-based international order. History, in the tragic, conflict-ridden sense, seemed destined to fade into memory. But as we now know, history had not ended. It had merely paused, waiting for conditions, actors, and ambitions powerful enough to reignite it. But the decades that followed slowly reshaped that early optimism into something far more fragile and uncertain. The so-called liberal international order, the network of norms and institutions built on American leadership, free trade, multilateral cooperation, and a shared commitment to democracy, began to weaken under its own weight. What once appeared solid now looked increasingly brittle. Globalization produced winners and losers. Trust in institutions eroded. New powers rose, and old powers questioned the costs of maintaining the system they had built. The United States, still the world's most powerful nation, now found its relative dominance challenged. China surged in economic and technological strength. Russia tested the limits of Western patience. Middle powers asserted themselves with unprecedented confidence. The unipolar moment that defined the 1990s faded, replaced by a more complex, more volatile landscape, a new era of multipolarity where rivalry among great powers once again shaped the rhythms of world politics. And within the United States itself, the shift was unmistakable. During Donald Trump's presidency, Washington turned sharply inward. A posture of strategic isolationism took hold, aimed not only at adversaries, but also at long-standing allies. European states were chastised for what Washington saw as insufficient defense spending. Trade imbalances became political flashpoints. And Trump's deep frustration with the European Union, particularly its habit of negotiating collectively rather than engaging the U.S. one-on-one, added new strains to the transatlantic relationship. Even after Trump left office, the underlying sentiment did not disappear. The political winds in Washington grew unpredictable, and many in Europe began to quietly fear that America's commitment to European security was no longer the ironclad guarantee it once had been. And so, as a major war erupted at its borders, the European Union, often described as an economic giant but a political and security dwarf, found itself in an unprecedented position, more isolated, more exposed, and more aware than ever that the security architecture it had relied upon for generations might no longer be able to shield it from the storms gathering on the horizon. This wider geopolitical shift has done more than strain old alliances. It has accelerated a profound regionalization of security. Across the world, states are no longer simply navigating global politics as isolated actors. Instead, they increasingly gravitate toward blocs of geographic proximity, shared ideology, or strategic necessity. And nothing has made this clearer than the global response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. When the United Nations General Assembly voted on the resolution condemning Russia's aggression, the numbers appeared decisive at first glance. 140 countries stood against the invasion. But the abstentions told a more revealing story. Some of the world's most influential states, China, India, Pakistan, South Africa, Iran, refused to take sides. Others, like Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia, cast votes in favor of condemnation, yet maintained an almost studied neutrality in practice. These were not random decisions. Many of these countries belong to regional or international groupings that challenge the American-led liberal order and increasingly align, whether subtly or openly, with China's concept of a new international order. Seen through this lens, the war in Ukraine becomes more than a territorial dispute or a clash of two nations. It becomes a catalyst, accelerating a much larger transformation in world politics. A shift away from global integration and toward what we might call enmity regionalization. Regions no longer form primarily for trade or cooperation, but through rivalry, through hardened identities, competing security visions, and the quiet but unmistakable logic of choosing sides. It is a world where blocs emerge not to bring states together, but to define who stands apart. A world shaped less by shared values than by sharpened divides. And in that world, the fault lines exposed by the war in Ukraine are not temporary fractures. They are the early contours of a new geopolitical reality. This new dynamic becomes strikingly visible when we look closely at voting behavior in the United Nations. On every major resolution condemning Russia's aggression, the European Union has voted in complete unanimity, 27 countries speaking with one voice. In contrast, the members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization tell a very different story. Almost without exception, they either abstain or actively oppose these resolutions, not because they support the invasion itself, but because their strategic interests, and increasingly their political identities, are drifting away from the Western-led order. These voting patterns are not random. They reveal a deeper transformation, the rise of identity-based regionalism. Blocs no longer form because states share institutions or economic frameworks. They form because they share grievances, distrusts, and competing visions of what the world should look like. Integration is no longer the glue. Exclusion is. States define themselves not by who they cooperate with, but by who they oppose. And this matters profoundly because the European Union and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization are no longer distant actors operating in separate spheres. Their geopolitical neighborhoods now collide. Their spheres of influence overlap. And at the very point where these worlds meet, a major conventional war is being waged, not in some distant region, but directly at the threshold of the European Union. Which leads to a question that can no longer be avoided, a question that may define the coming decades. Are we witnessing the birth of a new security order? One shaped not by cooperation, but by confrontation, not by American guarantees, but by an increasingly uncertain and inward-looking United States, and not by global institutions, but by deepening regional rivalries between Europe and the rising powers of Eurasia? Because if the answer is yes, then the war in Ukraine is not only a tragedy, it is a signal, the opening chapter of a darker, more divided era, a rift of civilizations. And that brings us to the end of this chapter of A Dark Dawn. The story of Russia's invasion, the unraveling of the post-Cold War order, and the emerging divide between Europe and the Eurasian powers is far from settled. In truth, we are only beginning to understand how these fractures will shape the decades ahead. The decisions made today, in Brussels, in Moscow, in Beijing, and in Washington, will echo across an entirely new geopolitical landscape. If this episode gave you insight into the shifting realities of our world, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps this podcast reach more listeners and ensures you'll be here for the next episode as we continue to trace the contours of this darker, more divided global dawn. Thank you for listening. Stay aware, stay inquisitive, and join me next time as we keep exploring the forces reshaping our age.